Welcome to another edition of Global Connect, World Missions Training and Discipleship Ministry presented to us virtually by our wonderful mission partners. First Pres World Missions is laser focused on promoting the establishment, growth, and maturation of Indigenous-led churches and movements in strategic global cities. You may ask, why church planting? Why cities? Not only cities, but global cities. What do you mean about movements? Today our guest speaker is Ralph Cunnington, pastor of City Church Manchester in England. Ralph will answer these questions and more.
Well, I'd like to share with you a little today about the importance of establishing church planting movements in strategic global cities. That's an initiative that First Pres Chattanooga you're already doing through your partnership with City Church Manchester, as well as with partnerships with a number of other hub churches in strategic global cities. We're going to be thinking about the importance of three things. Firstly, the importance of church planting, then the importance of movements, and then thirdly, the importance of reaching global cities. So firstly, the importance of church planting. And I want to say that church planting is both a biblical principle and also a biblical strategy. What do I mean when I say it's a biblical principle? Well, I think the message of the gospel demands church planting. In the 3rd century AD, the church father Cyprian famously declared, "Outside the church, there is no salvation." Now, that statement has been used and abused, particularly in the Middle Ages, to suggest that you cannot be saved unless you're a visible member of the Roman Catholic Church. And of course, that is utterly false. But rightly understood, Cyprian's statement actually conveys something which is really, really important. Because it is true to say that there is no salvation outside of Christ. And the church is Christ's body, which conveys the glorious good news of Jesus to a lost world through its words and also through its actions. So the way that people come to salvation is through the ministry of the church. Moreover, when people get saved, they're saved into the church. God the Father didn't send God the Son into the world to die so that we can be forgiven strangers. His plan was to create a new community. That means that local churches, they're not just convenient places to teach the Bible or to do evangelism. Local churches are an expression of God's purposes in the gospel. Listen to this, it's from Ephesians chapter 3. Paul here is describing his role as an apostle and as a church planter. He writes, "To me, though I am the very least of all the saints, this grace was given to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ and to bring to light for everyone what is the plan of the mystery hidden for ages in God, who created all things, so that through the church the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places." The universal church, and more specifically, the church's expression in local gatherings of believers, is a display of God's glory to the watching world here on earth, but even in the heavens. Therefore, it must be a matter of principle for us as people who believe the gospel, both to enlarge the communities of existing local churches that believe the gospel, and also to multiply and create more such congregations. So church planting is a principle, but it is also a biblical strategy. What do I mean? Well, firstly, I want to say it is a biblical strategy. That's different from saying it's a biblical command. It's clear that church planting was the practice of the early church, but the Bible doesn't tell us that we must follow that practice. It is simply shown to be a strategy that worked in the experience of the early church. So we see church planting happening throughout the book of Acts. It starts in Jerusalem, of course. And from there, church planting spreads throughout Judea, on into Samaria, to Antioch, and then to the rest of the world. We're going to come back to thinking a little bit more about how that happened in just a moment. But as well as seeing church planting as a strategy in the narrative of the book of Acts, we also see it as a strategy in Paul's letters as well. So we know from his letter to Titus, and we know from his first letter to Timothy, that Paul left members of his mission team behind in the regions that he visited to ensure that, having preached the gospel there, churches were planted and appropriate elders were elected to lead those churches. You see, Paul didn't simply want to see converts. He wanted to see healthy churches planted throughout the regions he visited. Church planting is a biblical strategy. It is also, secondly, an effective strategy. Tim Keller and the team at Redeemer Presbyterian in New York, they've done some really helpful research into the effectiveness of church planting. They found that new churches are much more effective at reaching both unchurched people and people outside the demographic of existing congregations. According to research from numerous studies, the average new church gains most of its new members, that's between 60 and 80% of its new members, from people who are not currently worshipping anywhere else. 60 to 80% of new members. By comparison, churches that are 10 to 15 years old, they gain 80 to 90% of their new members by transfer from other existing congregations. That means that the average new congregation will bring 6 to 8 times more new people into the life of the body of Christ than an older congregation of the same size. Why is that? Why are new congregations much more effective at reaching new people? Keller says this. He says, as a congregation ages, powerful internal institutional pressures lead it to allocate most of its resources and energy towards the concerns of its members and constituents, rather than towards those outside its walls. Older congregations, Keller says, have a stability and a steadiness that many people thrive on and need. Many non-Christians will only be reached by churches with long roots in the community and the trappings of stability and respectability. But, Keller writes, new churches of necessity are focused far more of their energies onto the needs of their non-members, and they become much more sensitive to the sensibility of non-believers. This has a cumulative effect, Keller says. In the first 2 years of our Christian walk, we have far more close face-to-face relationships with non-Christians than we do later on in our Christian lives. Thus, new Christians attract non-believers to services 5 to 10 times more than a long-time Christian. New believers beget new believers. New churches also find it easier to reach new generations, new residents and new people groups. In a large number of trivial ways, from language to dress codes to buildings to music to format of meetings and much, much more, a lot of what a church does tends to be stuck in something that is neither found in Scripture nor relevant to the culture. And church planting, it presents an incredible opportunity to reinvent those things that are not Bible essentials, such as the timing and length of our meetings, the venue we meet in, the style, the music, the staffing, the membership. There's an opportunity to reinvent those things in a way that relates more effectively to the world we actually live in. Also, new churches help to grow Christian people into leadership. If you've been in a church for any length of time, you'll know that it's a reality that every church has a committed core, which is always relatively small. This committed core, these people, often only 20 to 25% of the church, they buy into the vision. They give their time and their energy and their money in service to the vision of the church. And those people, by virtue of that sacrificial giving, they tend to grow much more quickly as disciples of Jesus. Church planting helps to address this problem of having a large fringe. I mean, think about it. How are you going to get more people to take on responsibility in your church? Is it going to be by growing your morning meetings from 500 to 600, or is it going to be by sending out 50 of those people to go away and start a new church? Church planting is a really effective strategy for moving people from the fringe of the church to the core of the church. So that is firstly the importance of church planting. Secondly, the importance of movements. Now, it needs to be said that the word movement can be a slippery concept. It can mean different things to different people in different contexts. So some people, they use the word movement simply to imply that what they're involved in is really exciting and dynamic. Sometimes the word movement is just used as spin to suggest something is bigger and more impressive than it is. That is not the way I'm using movement. Let me be clear what I'm trying to describe. I am speaking about a movement in contrast to an institution. A number of things mark out a movement when it's compared with an institution. Firstly, a movement is marked by a clear, concise, and compelling vision, accompanied by a set of compelling values. And people gather around that vision and those values. It is what gives the movement cohesion and energy and drive and commitment. The vision and values, they are caught by people and then shared with others, leading to rapid multiplication. Institutions, by contrast, they tend to be highly structured. They have rules and regulations, they have hierarchies. Secondly, a movement is marked by generosity. Institutions, they often want to guard what they already have. Therefore, they set the entry bar high and they're suspicious of other organisations because they're concerned that they might trample on their territory. Movements, by contrast, they're quick to offer the hand of friendship. They work generously with others who share the same vision and values, regardless of where those others are coming from and regardless of whatever overlap there might be with the work that they're already doing. Thirdly, movements are flexible and they can move very quickly indeed. Because they unify around a vision rather than a structure, they can pivot really fast with changing circumstances. If the vision demands a sudden change of direction, that is not a problem for a movement. Resources can be redeployed very quickly indeed. Fourthly, movements are innovative. Because institutions have a hierarchy and a structure, ideas usually trickle down from the top, and there are often institutional obstacles to those ideas being realised. Movements are much flatter, and all members are encouraged to think outside of the box, to share ideas if there's a possibility that those ideas will advance the common vision. The results of that creativity, it's exciting, it's innovative, there's ideas coming from everywhere. So that's what a movement is. But why is it important to have movements? Again, I think the answer is because it is a biblical strategy. If you know the book of Acts, you'll know that it all starts in Jerusalem. The world literally comes to Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, and a whopping 3,000 people are saved in a single day. It's incredible church growth. But mission, the actual sending out of people to go and make disciples of Jesus, that only happens accidentally. In Acts chapter 8, when following the persecution that broke out after the martyrdom of Stephen, the believers in Jerusalem, they're scattered all over Judea, Samaria and Asia Minor. But that accidental scattering, it resulted in something spectacular happening. A church was planted in the city of Antioch in modern-day Turkey. Now, Antioch, it was the third largest city in the Roman Empire. It was a strategic city. And as the gospel took root there in that third city, a movement began. What do I mean? Well, we're not told much about the converts in Acts chapter 11, but people rallied around the vision of that church. Barnabas was sent from Jerusalem to train up the members of the church in Antioch. And by the time we get to Acts chapter 13, we find the leadership of the church in Antioch made up of Jews and Gentiles, rich and poor, black and white. People rallied around a common vision rather than around common interests or social backgrounds. And it led to extraordinary generosity, open-handedness and innovation. In Acts chapter 11, they gave generously of their finances to go and help the mother church in Jerusalem. And in Acts chapter 13, they gave incredibly sacrificially of their people, sending out Saul and Barnabas to go and plant churches throughout Asia Minor. The church in Antioch, the movement in Antioch, it was innovative, it was self-sacrificial, it was generous, it was expectant. Those are all hallmarks of a movement. And that movement in Antioch resulted in the gospel multiplying and churches being planted throughout the Roman Empire, with the gospel ending up in the city of Rome itself. Movements are a biblical strategy for reaching the world. We need to support those people, those churches with a clear, concise and compelling vision. Those churches with a strong set of values which people rally around, expressing gospel generosity for the planting of churches to reach a region. Movements are essential. And usually they start in global cities, which is why reaching global cities is important. That's our third point. Remember that Antioch was the third largest city in the Roman Empire. That meant that it was a diverse, cosmopolitan, creative place, a cultural centre with excellent transport links and connections throughout the whole known world. Those factors combined to enable the church in Antioch to become an incredible hub for the planting of churches, not just throughout its own region of Asia Minor, but throughout the whole of Europe and the Near East. Paul's strategy in mission was to plant churches in the global cities of the Mediterranean basin. Sometimes it was large cities like Antioch or like Corinth. Corinth in Greece, it probably had a population of 500,000 people. Now that was absolutely massive by ancient standards. It was a New York. But Paul also targeted smaller cities that were centres of economic, intellectual and cultural influence. Athens, for example. Now, by the first century, Athens' population, it was less than 10,000 people. It was really insignificant population-wise. Yet it remained a great cultural and intellectual centre of influence. And so Paul used the opportunity he had there, while waiting for Silas and Timothy to catch up, to go to the Areopagus, preach the gospel, because he knew culturally that would impact the world. Paul targeted global cities because they presented the opportunity to establish a hub which could resource church planting throughout a whole region. You know, we find a great example of that in Acts chapter 19. Paul goes to Ephesus. Now Ephesus at the time was a huge commercial centre for the region. It was a kind of Chicago. And when Paul got there, he went into the city centre and he rented a large lecture hall. And there, verse 9 tells us he started to deliver daily lectures. And listen to what verse 10 tells us about those lectures. It says, "This continued for 2 years, so that all the residents of Asia heard the word of the Lord, both Jews and Greeks." Now that's fascinating. I'm guessing that not every single person in Asia heard the gospel as Paul preached in Ephesus. That can't be what Luke means in verse 10. Rather, what he's describing is Paul's strategy to start in the place where most people went, the city centre of Ephesus, so that people would be converted there, and then they would take the good news of Jesus back to their villages and towns, where churches could be planted and even more people hear the good news of Jesus. Almost certainly that is how the church in nearby Colossae was planted. That, you'll know, was a church that Paul wrote to. But in his letter to the Colossians, he says that he never actually visited the church. Rather, the gospel had been heard through Ephesus. You see, Paul operated the church planting strategy that focused on global cities as starting points. We are commanded to go and make disciples of all nations. Global cities are places to which all nations come. For example, my own city, the city of Manchester, it has over 200 languages spoken by long-term residents. Here at City Church, we have almost 40 different nationalities. We've seen Iranians, Yazidis, we've even seen someone who lived in Saudi Arabia get converted. Global cities, they are hubs from which the gospel can go out to the world. They are strategic centres for reaching the 1040 window. Global cities, they are also intellectual centres. They are also culture-forming capitals. What happens in cities like Antioch or Athens or Rome or New York, it reverberates around the world. So here in Manchester, we are home to the BBC and a large number of other television companies. We produce content that is watched around the whole world, in closed countries. We as a city, we are home to 100,000 college students from hundreds and hundreds of different nationalities. We have two of the largest global soccer teams in the world. Manchester is famed around the world, and alongside Liverpool, we are one of the music capitals of the world. If you reach a global city, you reach the world. We'd love to invite you to come and visit us here in Manchester to see what God is doing. When people come though, I need to tell you, they often have a mixed reaction. You see, we're quite a gritty city. We're where the Industrial Revolution started in the 19th century. We have more people in this city than we have trees. Sometimes I'm asked why I choose to live in Manchester. Why don't you live in a nicer place? There are lots of nicer places around Manchester. Ultimately, the reason I live here is that people matter more than trees. The Bible starts in the garden, Genesis chapter 2, but it ends in a city, Revelation 21. That is where we're heading. And here's the thing I hope I've shown. The way we get there, to our destination, that city, the New Jerusalem, is through partnering in the gospel, in the establishment of church planting movements in the global cities of our world. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for your support.
Thank you so much, Ralph. We are so grateful to partner with our friends at City Church Manchester, whom God is using in a marvelous way to reach Manchester, Northwest England, and beyond. If you would like to personally connect with Ralph and the team at City Church, please contact the World Missions Office.